Hi, I'm Bill Seelove. I'm a fourth-year medical student, and I'd like to talk to you about the basics of mechanical ventilator settings. What these settings are, how they relate to oxygenation and ventilation, and how they relate to complications of ventilators. Before we get into all that, though, I think it would be helpful to talk about what mechanical ventilation is. It used to be that when you would talk about mechanical ventilation, you would mean negative pressure ventilation. Back in the 1950s, when polio was epidemic, patients would climb into these big machines called iron lungs. It would basically cover them up completely from their neck down. And these machines would exert a negative pressure that would suck open the chest wall. Chest wall would open up the lungs with it. This would generate a negative pressure in the lungs that would draw air in. These machines worked great insofar as they mimicked normal physiology. After all, when you breathe, what do? Your diaphragm goes down. This opens up your lungs, causes a negative pressure that causes air to be drawn in. You essentially are a negative pressure ventilator. The problem with these negative pressure ventilator machines, though, was that they were too big, too impractical, too unwieldy. Look at them. They covered up the patient's entire body, so you couldn't even do a proper physical exam. That's why positive pressure ventilation was developed. Positive pressure ventilation works on the exact reverse principle of negative pressure ventilation. Instead of using a negative pressure to open up a patient's lungs from the outside, positive pressure ventilation takes high pressure air, superatmospheric pressure air, and forces it into the airways from the inside, essentially blowing the lungs open from the inside out. Now these machines, these positive pressure ventilators, are much more practical, much more convenient, much more easy to use than the negative pressure ventilators. But we're going to see that by violating normal physiology, by introducing a state where you have superatmospheric pressure rather than subatmospheric pressure in the lungs during inhalation, you're going to carry a number of complications. We'll look at those complications a little bit later. Now that we've established what positive pressure ventilation is, let's look at some of the indications. One indication might be if a person has airway protection problems. If a person isn't able to swallow, or if he's not able to cough up things that he aspirates, obviously this concerns us, because when secretions or matter of various kinds get into the deep airways, into the lungs, patient can get pneumonia or aspiration pneumonitis, or he can get lung abscesses. Positive pressure ventilation can help us with this. It can help protect the airway where the patient can't himself. Here's how. Basically, the ventilator tube goes down into a patient's trachea, right? That's just part of how it works. Toward the end of that tube is an apparatus called a cuff, which is like a big balloon that blows up, completely fills up the space in the trachea. Basically plugs off the trachea so no secretions or matter of any kind can get past it into the lower airways. In this way, it protects the patient's lower airways where the patient isn't able to himself. Let's look at another indication. Excessive work of breathing. Here, let's say a patient is having an asthmatic attack. His bronchi are constricted, and his bronchi are secreting mucus secretions. Altogether, this is spelling out a major increase in airway resistance. This increase in airway resistance is going to mean a lot more work for the diaphragm in bellowing air in and out of the lungs. It's going to have a lot of trouble working against this increased resistance. That can be really dangerous because you might end up having the diaphragm get fatigued, and then the patient can die. Positive pressure ventilation can help us out in this situation, because you can essentially use electricity to power the movement of the air in and out of the lungs, sparing the diaphragm from having to work, giving it a rest so that it can come back and fight another day. Another indication for positive pressure ventilation is depressed respiratory drive. Here, there's no problem with the diaphragm, no problem with the lungs, no problem with the alveoli, no problem with gas exchange or anything. Everything, for the most part, anatomically and physiologically, is picture perfect in the lungs. Here, the problem is a simple lack of motivation. Maybe due to a drug overdose, maybe due to damage to the medulla. Whatever the reason, the patient simply isn't inclined to breathe at a rate necessary to meet metabolic needs. Here we use positive pressure ventilation to pound in that air at the rate requisite to maintain life, where the patient isn't otherwise inclined to himself. Okay, good. So we've got these indications down. Let's say we have a patient that meets one of these indications and we want to ventilate him. What is it that we're trying to achieve through ventilation? Our goal with ventilation is very simple. It boils down to this. All we're trying to do is keep O2 up and keep CO2 controlled down at a reasonable level. That's it. That's all we're asking for. And you know what? Positive pressure ventilation will do this for us. It says, hey, you want O2 up? You want CO2 down? I will provide these services for you. And you know what? I will give them to you in a convenient, practical, easy-to-use package. There is just one catch, though. Remember how I said that positive pressure ventilation, by violating normal physiology, carries complications with it? Well, here are those complications. Here is the catch. Barotrauma, oxygen toxicity, Autopeep, diaphragm atrophy, decreased cardiac output, and ventilator-associated pneumonia. All these things come right along with the package of positive pressure ventilation. This is very serious. On the one hand, I have to get my patient adequately controlled O2 and CO2-wise, or the patient's going to die. On the other hand, though, these complications are liable to shred the patient's lungs to pieces, and he's liable to die anyway. I'm in a situation not unlike what Ulysses faced when he was sailing home from the Trojan War. One of the more interesting obstacles Ulysses came up against was a narrow passage of water called the Strait of Messina. On one side of this passage was a monster called Charybdis that made a big whirlpool that threatened to suck ships in and drown the crew members. On the other side of the strait was another monster called Scylla. Scylla had 6 heads, each with 3 rows of gnashing teeth, and it would tear crew members to pieces. This is exactly like the situation we're facing here. On the one hand, if we go real conservative with our ventilation, try to avoid ventilator-associated complications, then our patient is not going to get adequate gas exchange. He's not going to get adequate O2 and CO2 control, and he's essentially going to drown in this inadequate gas exchange. If, on the other hand, we go real aggressive with ventilation, then O2 and CO2 control will be fine. We'll steer well clear of Charybdis, but then we'll run afoul of Scylla, the 6-headed monster of complications of ventilation that rip our patient's lungs to pieces with barotrauma, oxygen toxicity, and the like. What I want to talk about now is the ventilator settings themselves, the various knobs and dials that we can tweak and adjust in order to try to navigate this narrow passage, try to get our patient through alive, trying to avoid the monster on each side. First setting is trigger. Trigger just means what is it that makes the ventilator deliver a breath. And in most cases, this is going to be negative pressure generated by the patient. Patient starts to try to take a breath, diaphragm comes down, negative pressure is generated in the lungs. Machine picks up on this, says, hey, I think this guy's trying to take a breath, and delivers a breath. The trigger has an adjustment to it called sensitivity. You can set the sensitivity high such that the slightest little negative pressure and the machine will fire, or you can set the sensitivity really low so that it takes a great deal of negative pressure in order to get the machine to fire. Let's examine this. Say I have the sensitivity of the trigger set really low. That means that it takes a great deal of effort on the part of the patient. He really has to muster an effort in order to generate enough negative pressure to get the machine to fire. That's a problem, because if the patient has to work too hard to get the machine to fire, he's working too hard to breathe, and that defeats the whole purpose of ventilation to begin with. Okay, so let's set the sensitivity really high. Then we have another problem, because if the sensitivity on the trigger is set really high, then the machine is on a hair trigger, and it's going to fire at the drop of a hat. And it might fire at inappropriate times. A patient, for instance, might be mid an exhalation, and the machine might pick up a little oscillation in the pressure, misinterpret it as an effort to take another breath, and fire a breath inappropriately. Remember, I said the patient hadn't finished exhaling yet, so this new breath comes in before he finished exhaling. This new breath stacks on top of the old breath, and the patient's lungs get blown open further and further, and he can get excessive stretch and a complication called Barrow trauma that we'll discuss more later. So our key in dealing with trigger is to set the sensitivity high enough that the patient doesn't have to work too hard to breathe, yet low enough that we don't have the machine firing inappropriately. Let's look at the next setting. Next setting to talk about is respiratory rate. Respiratory rate just means how many breaths per minute is the ventilator delivering. And respiratory rate, we're going to find, is our key way to control CO2, one of the key ways to control CO2 level. Remember, we said going into this, our whole idea with ventilation is keep O2 up and keep CO2 down. As far as CO2 goes, as far as controlling that component of it, respiratory rate is absolutely key. The other key player in CO2 control is tidal volume. Tidal volume just means how much air is coming in with each breath. If I take respiratory rate, number of breaths per minute, and multiply it by tidal volume, total amount of air coming in with each breath, I get minute ventilation, which means complete amount of air coming into the patient's lungs per minute. And the higher the minute ventilation, the lower I can get the patient's CO2. So respiratory rate and tidal volume, main ways for CO2 control. But you know what? To be honest, between these two, respiratory rate and tidal volume, it's really respiratory rate that we have the most room to play with. As far as tidal volume goes, we're pretty restricted. We have to keep the tidal volumes relatively low. Let me explain. It used to be that we would experiment with tidal volumes that were high, like 10, 15, 20 milliliters per kilogram of body weight. So a 70 kilogram guy might have gotten a liter tidal volume. It was found, though, that these large tidal volumes ended up causing too much distension of the lungs, too much maximum stretch on the alveoli, and this caused Barrow trauma. So now we keep the tidal volumes low, down to 8 milliliters per kilogram of ideal body weight. So our 70 kilogram patient, now we would be talking 560 milliliter tidal volume, down to half of the liter that we would have been talking before. And if he has ARDS, then we're down to 6 milliliters per kilogram of ideal body weight, or 420 milliliters tidal volume. So bottom line here again, respiratory rate and tidal volume, main ways to control CO2, and respiratory rate is really what we have the most wiggle room with. Let's look at our next setting. Positive end expiratory pressure, or PEEP. This just means how much air, how much pressure is still in the lungs, still in the alveoli, at the end of exhalation. After you've exhaled all your air, how much pressure is still in there? Why do we care about that? Why do we want to have pressure still in the alveoli at the end of exhalation? Well, here's why. Patients, especially patients with ARDS, can have their alveoli collapse at the end of exhalation. Because patients who have ARDS and some other lung problems might have a deficiency of surfactant in there. If the alveolus collapses, then the blood that goes around that alveolus doesn't pick up any oxygen. You get what's called a shunt situation. Then when this blood with a dearth of oxygen enters the general pool of blood leaving the lungs, it doesn't contribute anything. It's like a freeloader. And you end up with an overall decrease in oxygenation. If I use PEEP, if I use positive end expiratory pressure, then I can have air in there at the end of exhalation that's holding open the alveolus, keeping it from collapsing, and thereby preventing that shunt situation from developing. In this way, PEEP can improve my overall oxygenation. Next up, we have flow rate. Flow rate just means for my given tidal volume of air that's coming in, delivered by the machine, how fast is that tidal volume being delivered? I can set the flow rate so that it is slow, or I can set the flow rate so that it's fast. Let's say I set the flow rate slow. If the flow rate is slow, that tidal volume is being delivered slow, and it's taking a long time for inhalation. Took a long time, and that's a problem, because if the inhalation takes a long time, I have less time left over for exhalation. Remember, we're working at a set respiratory rate. We're on a clock here. Say if I'm working at a respiratory rate of 15 per minute, I've only got 4 seconds total for each breath. If the flow rate is slow, making the inhalation take a long time, then there's less time left over from that 4 seconds for the exhalation. And that's a real problem if the patient has COPD. COPD patients take a long time to exhale. So if it took a long time to inhale, then during their exhalation, they might be taking so long that they run out of time and a new breath gets delivered before they exhaled all their old air. In this case, you get a breath stacking on top of the old one, and you end up with excessive stretch, and you end up with Barrow trauma. So, what we want to do is set a fast flow rate in a situation like this. If we set the flow rate fast, inhalation takes almost no time at all. Then you have all kinds of time to breathe out all the air before the new breath gets delivered. Key with the COPD patient, keep the flow rate fast so that we can maximize the amount of time the patient has for expiration versus the amount of time it takes for inspiration. Next setting is flow pattern. Flow pattern just means for my given flow rate, what's the rate of change of that flow rate basically? For instance, I could have that air come in at a constant speed. That we would call a square pattern. Or I might have the flow rate start out slow, but build up speed as it goes along, accelerate. That we would call a ramp pattern. And it's been found that a ramp pattern allows for more even distribution of air throughout the lungs. There are other patterns too, but we won't bother going into those right now. Finally, the last setting we have is fraction of inspired oxygen, or FiO2. And this is the key way that we have to control oxygenation, to keep the O2 up. Now, fraction of inspired oxygen is basically just of the air that the machine is delivering, what percentage of that is oxygen? As far as our strategy goes for fraction of inspired oxygen, we're generally going to start out at 100% fraction of inspired oxygen to try to get the patient's arterial oxygen level up to target as rapidly as possible. Here's the key though. Once we have gotten the patient up to his target arterial oxygen, then we want to crank down the fraction of inspired oxygen we're delivering through the ventilator to the minimum we can get away with while still meeting this arterial oxygen goal. The reason for that is we want to avoid a complication called oxygen toxicity. And we're going to talk a little bit more about that later. All right, on this slide, we've done some good things. We've established what the ventilator settings are, and we've talked a little bit about some of the complications associated with these settings, but mostly what we've talked about is how these settings relate to CO2 control and O2 control. As far as controlling CO2 goes, respiratory rate and tidal volume are our key players. And as far as O2 control goes, keeping the O2 up, fraction of inspired oxygen is the most important, and PEEP also plays an important role. So basically, we've discussed how to avoid the monster Charybdis, how to avoid having our patient drown in inadequate gas exchange. Now let's look a little bit more closely at the other monster. Scylla of ventilator-associated complications. Let's look at how these complications relate to our trigger settings and how we can, or rather to our ventilator settings, and how we can hopefully avoid these complications. First setting is barotrauma. This is caused mainly by a high tidal volume and high PEEP. If I have a high tidal volume, say, then that means that a lot of air is coming in with each breath. And a lot of air coming in with each breath means that there's going to be a high maximum distension of my lungs and my alveoli. When the alveoli get real stretched out, it can cause a problem in a couple of different ways. One way is a stretched out alveolus can burst. And when the alveolus ruptures, air works its way into the interstitium. From there, the air can dissect into the perivascular sheath, where it can find its way into the into the mediastinum and into the pleural space. So I can get pneumomediastinum and pneumothorax. It also causes a problem in another way. A stretched out alveolus irritates the alveolus. The alveolus doesn't like to be stretched out. So it puts out distress signals called cytokines. Cytokines are like little red flags that attract neutrophils and inflammatory cells. And when these inflammatory cells come in, they shoot first and ask questions later. They cause all kinds of damage, like calling Dirty Harry in. They damage type 2 pneumocytes, which ends up meaning reduced surfactant output and atelectasis in the lungs. And they also end up causing increased capillary permeability, so that you end up with a lot of fluid getting into the interstitial space, interfering with gas exchange. And ultimately, all this inflammation can lead to acute lung injury and acute respiratory distress syndrome. So it's a bad scene. Next complication I want to talk about is oxygen toxicity. And this, of course, is caused mostly by a high fraction of inspired oxygen. If I have a high fraction of inspired oxygen, then that's going to mean that there's a high concentration of oxygen in my airways, in my alveoli. And what does oxygen do? Oxygen likes to steal electrons. Oxygen is electronegative. So it goes in and it steals electrons, and that generates free radicals. And free radicals run rampant through the airways and alveoli like little berserkers, causing all kinds of damage. So again, you can get an acute lung injury or acute respiratory distress syndrome sort of problem from oxygen toxicity. Another problem from O2, from high fraction of inspired oxygen, is something called absorptive atelectasis. Let me explain how that works. A normal person breathing normal air is breathing 21% oxygen, and the rest of that air is nitrogen. So this air comes in, fills up an alveolus. The 21% oxygen diffuses into the blood and the capillaries that are going around that alveolus. So the alveolus shrinks down some as the oxygen leaves, but then it stops. It doesn't shrink anymore. The reason is because still in that alveolus is the nitrogen. See, nitrogen doesn't diffuse. It just sits there, fills the space, prevents the alveolus from collapsing. What if, on the other hand, though, I was to have 100% fraction of inspired oxygen? In that case, it would pretty much all be oxygen in there. The oxygen gets greedily gobbled up by the capillaries, and the alveolus shrinks down and down and down, and hey, there's nothing stopping it. It keeps on shrinking until it collapses, because there's no nitrogen in there. That's absorptive atelectasis. Next complication we have is decreased cardiac output. This is caused mostly by a high positive end expiratory pressure, high respiratory rate, and high tidal volume. Why do I get decreased cardiac output? Well, remember, with positive pressure ventilation, I'm ending up with an unnatural kind of situation. With normal physiologic breathing, I have negative pressure in my lungs during inhalation. With positive pressure ventilation, I have supraatmospheric pressure in the lungs during inhalation. On top of that, I might also be using positive end expiratory pressure. So as a result of this, I'm having a higher baseline end expiratory pressure, and I'm also having a higher and inspiratory pressure. And altogether, this is going to mean a higher mean intrathoracic pressure than I would have under physiological conditions. With higher intrathoracic pressure, there's going to be less of a pressure gradient for the blood in the veins draining into the thorax. That's going to mean blood is going to be less inclined to go into the thorax, into this high pressure situation, and it's going to go into the thorax slower. That means that there's going to be reduced right atrial filling, and you're going to end up with reduced preload, reduced cardiac output. This high intrathoracic pressure also reduces cardiac output in another way, because high intrathoracic pressure puts the squeeze on the pulmonary vasculature. This backs up blood into the pulmonary arteries and spells out to a higher afterload for the right heart. With the right ventricle having higher afterload, it can't put out as much blood, and it ends up getting distended with blood. This causes it to elbow the intraventricular septum into the left ventricle. Left ventricle being impinged on by the intraventricular septum has impaired diastolic filling, and that's going to mean a further reduction in cardiac output. Next complication I want to look at is Autopeep. This is caused mainly by a high respiratory rate, high tidal volume, and a trigger that's too sensitive. We've already touched on what happens when you have a trigger that's too sensitive. So let's take a look at high respiratory rate and high tidal volume and what the implications of that here are. If I have a really high respiratory rate and high tidal volume, that means there's a lot of air coming into my lungs every minute. And this air might be coming into my lungs at a faster rate than I'm capable of exhaling. Remember, as far as exhalation goes, this is purely based on the elasticity of my lungs. It's a purely passive process. It's not like the ventilator is sucking out air for me. It's only giving me, it's only improving my inhalation. It's not doing anything for my exhalation. Exhalation is entirely up to me. So if the ventilator is delivering air at a faster rate than I can breathe it out, then there's going to be an overall buildup. There's going to be a surplus of air in my lungs that's building and building and building. And this is going to mean that my lungs are going to swell out more, my alveoli are going to swell out more, and I'm going to get Barrow trauma. It also causes a problem in another way. It's going to cause a problem of decreased cardiac output. Decreased cardiac output over and above what I just said we ordinarily get just from being on positive pressure ventilation to begin with. See, with this Autopeep situation, I've got being unable to breathe out the air as fast as it's coming in, having this ever-increasing intrathoracic pressure. I have interthoracic pressure over and above the interthoracic pressure that I normally get from positive pressure ventilation, and cardiac output being inversely proportional to the intrathoracic pressure. I'm going to have cardiac output at an all-time low, even lower than the normal positive pressure ventilation baseline. Finally, we have diaphragm atrophy and ventilator-associated pneumonia. These are the last two heads on the monster Scylla of ventilator-associated complications. Ventilator-associated pneumonia is basically just going to be an infection from gram-negative organisms like Pseudomonas aeruginosa that use the ventilator tubing as conduit to get into your lungs. And diaphragm atrophy is going to be just basically your diaphragm getting lazy from having all the work done for it. These two complications are going to be mainly a product just of how long you're on ventilation. So in summary, these complications that I've gone over and how they relate to ventilator settings go a little bit like this. Autopeep, caused mainly by a trigger that's too sensitive and high respiratory rate and high tidal volume. Barrow trauma, caused mainly by excessively high tidal volume and high PEEP. Decreased cardiac output, caused mainly by a respiratory rate that's too high, a tidal volume that's too high, and a PEEP that's too high. and oxygen toxicity caused mainly by a fraction of inspired oxygen that is too high. And then the last two, ventilator-associated pneumonia and diaphragm atrophy, caused mainly by how long the patient is on the ventilator. I really hope that this has helped you out. I just wanted to cover the basics of the ventilator settings, how they relate to the complications, how they relate to to ventilation and oxygenation. I hope this has helped you out, and I wish you the best of luck. Thank you.